All right, welcome back to the third part of our Biology of Sex series for STEM 118. And now we get into the evolution of sexual reproduction. This is a big one, and there's just a couple slides in here that I'm going to talk about stuff, but really they're highlighting what you could take a whole class on. So I'm going to go over some stuff that may seem like it's a lot, but if you think about it, it's fun. And there's, like I said, plenty of books to read and courses to take if this is interesting to you. So we thought about some questions when we started off. Again, how can sex be non-binary? And I think we've kind of gone over that from a molecular point of view. We certainly can see a spectrum of male to female and intersex in between. Now, what it says is what's the reason to have two sexes, right? Why can't we have sperm generators and egg generators, but, no difference other than that, okay? And why only two, right? So let's explore that a little bit. And let's talk about, is there any advantage to different sexes? So, again, what if there were no differences between people sexually and anybody could reproduce with anybody else, right? With consent, of course. And how exciting would it be if we could really mix up more mating types? Now, there are certain fungi that have many different kinds of mating types and can work that way, but generally for animals, there tends to be two. It's almost universal among plants and animals, right? That spectrum that we see phenotypically is between what we think of as male and female. So why might that be? And so what we want to consider is what is the life cycle that animals follow, and it's called the gametic life cycle, right? So the gametic life cycle is this idea that you have two diploid organisms that are going to mix their DNA, right? So right there, you beg the question for sexual reproduction, why do that? Wouldn't it be more advantageous for me to not have to rely on finding another organism to reproduce with? Wouldn't it be more advantageous that when I have enough resources just to pop out another me and perpetuate my DNA? Well, the fact that sexual reproduction is almost universal among eukaryotic organisms, like not bacteria, even though bacteria have mechanisms for exchanging DNA as well. The fact that sexual reproduction is basically ubiquitous means that there must be a huge advantage. Right, so evolution would not have selected for continuing this mechanism if there weren't some advantage. And the idea that when you mix DNA, you create new unique phenotypes. And diversity in a population is very highly prized from an evolutionary point of view. That's because environments change. And if a population is too homogeneous, if the environment changes in a deleterious manner, then that population is wiped out. That DNA has hit a dead end. It has gone extinct, right? So there's built-in mechanisms for species to maintain diversity, differences among individuals, and sexual reproduction is one of the main ways to do that. So in the gametic life cycle, what we have is individuals that go through a special kind of cell division called meiosis, which takes that diploid cell and makes haploid cells, meaning they have that one copy. That's sperm and egg, right? So those haploid gametes now can fuse and get you back up to, for humans, 46 chromosomes and 2 copies of each, right? So with that, we're going to think about the differences between sperm and egg. How is that driving this idea of two different sexes? So sperm are small and highly motile. They can move very quickly. They don't have very much going on besides the DNA they carry. Now, eggs, in contrast, are the exact opposite. They are very big, very expensive to make biologically, but rich in resources, right? So basically, when the sperm, which is cheap, gets there, all it delivers is the nucleus. And now the egg has everything it needs in it for that nucleus to fuse with the egg's nucleus. Now we have what's called a zygote. And that zygote cytoplasm, that first starting cell is basically what the egg had. And that's a lot. And that sets up everything for the correct development of that individual, right? And that's true for animals and plants, right? Now, what we may have seen very early in the development of kind of evolution of sex is a different kinds of gametes, right? So we might have had some medium-sized gametes. Maybe they were fairly modal, like they could move around okay, and they had some resources, but they weren't very good at either. So what we're basically saying is that as we continue to try different strategies, as we had diversity early in time of, or in the evolution of organisms, we tried different strategies, and the strategy anisogamy, this idea of having two different sized gametes, is that those species that produced individuals, some of which produced very small modal gametes, and had some individuals in the same population who produced very large resource-rich gametes, they did the best. So what we're saying is that if you were a species that produced the happy medium, they had gametes that could move and had some resources, that wasn't as good as specializing, as having some gametes that were really fast and some gametes that were really rich in resources. And that is then what has spawned what we think of as this polarity between male and female. All right. Now there are some other factors that may be involved in that as well that reinforce the maintenance of those two sexes, and it stems from the fact that mitochondria have their own DNA. Now, we haven't talked a whole lot about cell biology, but in eukaryotic cells, the kind of organisms that we are, plants and animals and fungi, everything but bacteria, we have cells, and inside those cells are little rooms, different compartments, organelles. And one of those organelles is responsible for making our energy, ATP. It's the biological equivalent of gasoline or electricity. It's powering us. It's powering the reactions in our cells. Now, again, a whole lot going on here. The cool thing about mitochondria is that they were probably one time free-living bacteria that then came into a mutual relationship billion or 2 years ago with other cells, and we started to form eukaryotic cells. They brought their own DNA with them, and a little bit of that still remains. Okay, and that's really important, that those genes that the DNA and mitochondria encode for are important to some of the really volatile reactions inside the mitochondria. So it has to have kind of like immediate response. So with that, we think that there is pressure to avoid what's called heteroplasmy. And that's the idea that a cell would contain organelles with different genomes, right? So different DNA. So we avoid that by saying, hey, you know, the only gamete that gets to have the mitochondria are the egg cells. So the sperm can come by and they can dump off their nuclear DNA. Those 23 chromosomes are going to combine with the other 23 in the egg to make 46. But then all the mitochondria always come from the egg. Okay, what that does is ensure that there's good communication between the mitochondria and the nucleus, because they've already been doing it, right? If I bring in a third mitochondria or another kind of mitochondria, now we got three genomes that are kind of trying to coordinate, and we're not used to that, and it may not work so well. Now, it has been seen, and we do see it, but it's rare, and it's tolerated, but it's probably not selected for. So you know that then all your mitochondria come from your maternal lineage, okay, from your mom, from the egg producers in your life, right? So that's a little complicated, especially if you've never heard any of that stuff before, but it is some really interesting things to think about as to why we have those two sexes. Now, again, being kind of human-centric, focusing on that, we do see differences, physical differences between the sexes. And what we call that, as I referred to before, sexual dimorphism. Di to morph is form. So we have two forms for the different sexes in humans and in many creatures, right? And we're going to see that it varies in its magnitude. So we have morphological differences between the sexes of the same species, but we really want to think about this idea that we've got egg producers and sperm producers, and there's some typical differences. Obviously, sex organs, right? Penises and testes versus vaginas and ovaries and uteruses. Then we have our secondary sex characteristics developed at puberty. Again, all this is programmed in your genes. And then among humans, we see that physical size, males tend to be about 10 to 15% larger than females. And that's, again, on average. And we're going to discuss that a little bit more towards the end here. Okay? So we do see some degree of sexual dimorphism in humans, and we tend to latch onto that as we say, ooh, male, oh, female, right? But again, if we really think about intersex, that's where the power of kind of the archetype doesn't need to be true, right? Like you have a mixing as we move across the spectrum of what we think of as male to female. Now, why does that come about? Why do we see dimorphism? And let me tell you right now, I'm just going to say it right now, and I'm going to show you some pictures in a second, that the dimorphism we see in humans is by far not the most extreme, right? We're pretty much the same. So where does dimorphism come from? So we have to get back into evolution just a little bit more. Again, such a great topic, super layered. Different kinds of selection. Natural selection is maybe something that you've heard of. People talk about Darwinian selection and natural selection. And this is the idea that those individuals that have phenotypes that are most fit to their environment are then most likely to pass on their genes. And because their genes resulted in their phenotype, that phenotype then is seen more in the next generation. That's evolution, right? That's interaction between a species, living organisms, and their environment, right? That's natural selection. And that is a huge, hugely powerful director when it comes to evolution. Now, there are other influences on passing on your DNA, and sexual selection is another component of evolution. And this deals with, I don't care how well adapted you are to your environment, gotta have that. If I can't survive my environment, I don't have a chance. But if I'm well adapted to my environment, but can't pass on my genes, I'm dead in the water as well. So the component of finding a mate and successfully reproducing comes into the realm of sexual selection, right? This is where things like the peacock's tail come from, right? So a peacock versus a peahen, very different, right? The peahens don't have these extravagant displays of color and feathers, right? Why? Well, that tail is very attractive to females, right? And so if you got a great tail and you're a peacock, you are going to find more peahens to mate with, and hence your genes get passed on. And your children, because they have your genes, some of them will have magnificent tails like you do, and so on and so forth, right? Now, there's a lot of theories about this, when we talk about runaway sexual selection. It's like, man, that's a great tail, but is that good for survival? Like, no, not really. The only thing that tail is good for is reproducing, is finding a mate, right? But in fact, that tail might be a detriment to survival, right? You're standing out in a crowd, and if something's out there that's a predator is like, well, I can see you pretty well, now I'm going to eat you because your tail is so flamboyant, well, that kind of defeats the purpose. So there's a lot of really interesting theories on how sexual selection and natural selection kind of interweave, but we also talk about the good genes hypothesis. This idea that if I have such a flamboyant sexual display, it's actually a detriment to my survival, it must mean that my genes are so good that I can survive to reproduce even though I have this hindrance, right? Now, this can reach extremes, right? So we think about the Irish elk. Here is a species that went extinct, and antlers are part of sexual selection, and they are used for combat to acquire females and for display, right? Now, the problem is if having bigger antlers give you more success for display, attracting females, and for combat, what if they get too big, right? And we think that this is probably why this species went extinct, because the antlers got so large, meters across, that it became such a hindrance that they didn't survive anymore, right? So this can drive a species into the ground if you get this idea of kind of runaway sexual selection, right? Now, going back to the idea of sexual dimorphism, we see that it varies. So even looking at our closest relatives evolutionarily, we look at the bonobos, Paniscus. The differences between male and female bonobos is very, very small. They have almost no sexual dimorphism. Gorillas, also close relatives to us, not as close as the bonobos, but they have significant differences between males and females. The males are very much larger than the females, and they're one of the largest examples of sexual dimorphism among primates, right? Now, you can see much more examples of sexual dimorphism in nature, right? So as we get out to other species, we see the anglerfish, right? So if you've ever seen Finding Nemo, when they go deep down the water and then the light glows, and it's like, this is the anglerfish, right? So you might say, I've got two pictures here, one of them is male, one of them is female, and you would be wrong, right? Because both of these that you see are female predominantly, but there is a male in the picture. So if you look at the kind of orangish one, there's a little kind of blob on the side of that orange. That's the male. Okay. So now if again you want to kind of boil things down to sperm producers and egg producers, this is a great example. Because when an anglerfish, a male anglerfish, finds a female anglerfish and they mate, the male attaches to the side of the female and basically is absorbed by the female's body, and the testes are retained by the female to use when she needs. So the male is basically destroyed in the act of saying, here are my sperm-producing organs, and the female goes on to live their life, to eat and reproduce now with the male sperm as she wants to. Kind of a different system, right? So when we think about sexual dimorphism, again, for humans, it's not really that big. And so this brings us to the last topic I want to bring up that we're going to revisit again this quarter a lot, and the statement that statistical differences are not categorical differences, right? So this often means that there's differences between the means, between the averages, and the degree of similarity is lost, right? So it means that there's overlap. So this is just an example chart, and it shows you, like, if we took like an example of whatever trait we're measuring for males and an example of whatever that same trait for females, you see that the curves are slightly different, that the averages, the means, where the dotted lines are not exactly in the same spot. But there's a whole lot of overlap there, right? So were we to think about male and female, just for size, if we say that males are 10 to 15% larger on average, it would mean that the largest male is going to be usually about 10% bigger than the biggest female in any given population of humans, right? But what's that to say about the other 90% of the males and females that are out there, right? It means that in any given sense that those females could be just as big as 90% of the males, right? So what we want to think about then is when, especially as we get into next week, when we talk about the average female brain and the male, like they won't even say that, they'll say the male brain versus the female brain. They're talking about averages. And what I want to say here too is the fact that when you average something, you may never see the average example in existence, right? I can take a bunch of numbers, a whole set of numbers, say there's thousands of them, and the average is 50, between 1 and 100, and the average is 50. Does that mean that anywhere in my set of numbers I actually have the number 50? No, but the average is 50, right? So when we talk about differences between males and females, almost always people are talking about the average. And what they forget about is that curve that has lots of overlap. And that's where we see the intersects, the phenotypic differences that are between the two extremes of what we think about as male and female. Okay? So I hope this is interesting, and we will discuss more in class. Thanks, everybody.